I'm so happy, actually, to have Alex here. Alex Cowan. He's a serial entrepreneur, very successful in the space of software development and enterprise software, telecommunications software. He's also a mentor for startups. And I gotta say, firsthand experience, he's an awesome mentor. Great guy, really insightful, right to the point, and encouraging. So, stellar mentor. If you ever have a chance to work with him, go for it. So, he's going to tell us more about his book that he wrote. He has some of these books available if you want to get one afterwards. So let's all give Alex a warm-up.
Thanks for coming. I thought that since we all have this in common, I would start with my Stanford story. The alumni site says that I graduated in 2000, but that's actually not true. I dropped out in '99. Don't tell the Chamberlain or the headmaster who does that, please. I do use the site sometimes. I left in '99 with some of my classmates to go spend all these dollops of .com money that were floating around. And after that, a number of things happened. Some of them, strange, baffling, but genuinely enjoyable. And led me here tonight to be with you guys. During the daytime hours, I mostly run Leonid Systems. Leonid is an enterprise software company I started that provides enterprise software to operators, companies like Verizon, France Telecom, who are offering cloud services. And by night, or my hobby time, I'm the author of Starting a Tech Business, which is a book about bringing your ideas to life, and that's what we're going to talk about today. My main area of interest is that there are all these really great ideas about how to build better products and better companies. And these are well-liked ideas. It's not like there are pundits out there arguing about whether these are good or bad ideas. And yet, the interesting thing is that they're very rarely practiced, relatively speaking. And so that's weird. Why is that? And that question of why that is, and more importantly, how you change that, is really my primary area of interest and endeavor with the book and speaking and mentoring. The thing that we're going to do today is take a practical view of how to apply some of these things. Let's talk about you guys for a second. So I'm assuming a few things about you all. One, you have the desire to learn about launching new ideas. Two, I'm not assuming you have any particular technical knowledge of any sort. And then I'm assuming that you want to take action, that you want to walk out of here with specific ideas that you can go and apply to your venture. Is that a reasonably okay set of assumptions? Because I'm not here to bore you guys. Okay. So we're going to talk about these 4 areas. These are 4 areas where there's kind of an old set of ideas that don't work very well, especially for startups. And then we're going to talk about new ways of doing things, new ideas that are particularly appropriate for startups. And for our purposes here, we'll define a startup as any company that's still learning about what problem it's going to go after and what solution it's going to apply to that problem. So the first thing we're going to talk about is ideation. Ideation is a process of pulling together the conceptual basis for your idea. And before, you had this, basically what I would call self-love. You have this idea, it's your baby, you're just going to stick with it to the bitter end or the sweet end or whatever end comes about, because that's your responsibility, it's your idea, right? And now we have this idea of design thinking, which involves applying empathy and creativity to observations about what you're learning about and being able to apply those things and change your idea on that basis. I would say the self-love idea culminated in the .com period. How many of you guys were out in the workforce during the .com period? Probably most of you, right? It was a very frothy time. And nevertheless, though, where did this come from? I think it's a very classical idea in some ways, this idea of self-love. Henry Ford said, how many of you guys know the Henry Ford quote? If I asked customers what they wanted, they would have told me they wanted a faster horse. So there's a certain amount of validity to this idea, especially when you're breaking new ground. But look at Ford now. And I think that you can unequivocally say that, at least after your product in the market, this idea of design thinking is something that you can and you should apply. I think it's almost inarguable. Very, very few people would say, no, I don't want to do that. So we're going to talk about what design thinking is and some practical ways that you can go and do it. I would say there's two pillars to design thinking. It's very simple in a lot of ways: empathy and creativity. And it's kind of the one follows the other more or less. So you see a seamstress here. Seamstresses spend a lot of time cutting. They require a lot of dexterity. They may sit there cutting for a long time. Somebody that understood the seamstress went out and created sewing scissors. Have you ever picked up a pair of sewing scissors? They're great. I mean, unlike regular scissors, your hands slide right into them. You can sit there cutting forever. They're terrific. They're very appropriate to this particular problem. So there are fortunately some very ready-made tools you can use to apply design thinking. You've probably heard about some of them. One of them is personas. A persona is a vivid depiction of your user or your buyer. Everything about how they're going to learn about your product, how they're going to buy it, how they're going to use it, how they're going to reuse it and rebuy it. This is an example of a bad persona. And this is where a lot of people start off. I certainly did. The problem with this persona is that it looks like this is a bunch of stuff that was taken off the internet. Probably any one of you guys could put this together in about 10 minutes. It's bullet points, clip art, and it looks like these percentages here came off of a questionnaire. And this is a subtle but important point about practicing design thinking and going out and talking to prospective customers, people in your marketplace. You can ask them certain types of questions, but not other questions, and get good answers back. You can ask them questions about factual things. How many times did you eat potatoes last month? How do you feel when you go to the dentist? But if you ask them about, hey, would you like such and such of a heart stent put in you, or would you like this app that I'm building, you probably won't get a very good answer back. You'll probably get an answer like, that sounds great. Because people are nice. They don't want to tell you they don't want your thing. And they probably don't even really know whether they want it or not. There's a great story about this from Sony. Has anybody heard the yellow Walkman story? Remember when Sony had those yellow Walkman when they had Walkmans? And then Sony made a yellow Walkman because this was the new thing at the time. So they had a focus group. They pulled all these people in off the street and they said, hey, what do you think about this yellow Walkman? And they all said, it's terrific, great, sporty, so much more interesting than the black Walkmans they used to have. I don't think I would want one of those. And then somebody had the foresight to put 2 piles of Walkmans by the door, and these people were allowed to take one. And nobody took the yellow Walkman. Not a single person took the yellow Walkman. Shocking. They all lied to the person running the focus group. And if you ask questions like, hey, do you want my thing? Expect to be lied to. And then it's because people are trying to be nice and they don't really know themselves that way. What you really want to be doing is going out and observing these people. It's like Animal Planet, but with users. You're going out, your job is to observe them in their natural environment. Because remember, you're not going to be there convincing them that they want your thing. Your job is to learn about what they would do left to their own devices, what's their life like, what do they do all day in your particular area of interest. This is a somewhat better persona, and you can see the photo is kind of lo-fi. It was taken with an iPhone. That's fine. And it's a story. It's a narrative about this person. It's like we're going to write a short story about them or profile them for a news story or something like that. And don't just focus on, how old are they? Do they do such and such a thing in your area of endeavor? Seek to understand them and know them like a regular person. And I highly encourage you, and I do this with my own staff at Leonid, I always, name the persona, like Bob the baker or Charlie the CEO. And the reason we do that, it seems a little juvenile, but it actually helps you veer away from that tendency to create these kind of arbitrary personas, which everybody's natural tendency to do that, myself included. It brings you back to the idea that this is a real person and I'm trying to test these ideas against real people out in the real world. Then the next tool that we have is user stories follow from personas. User stories are highly consumable from the standpoint of building things, descriptions of intent, of what these personas want to do in your area of endeavor. And they have a very specific format. As whatever your persona is, I want to do something or rather, and then this is one of the most important parts, so that I can derive a benefit of some sort. And the interesting thing when I'm working with my own staff at Leonid and folks that I help with startups is that it's this third element here, this derive a benefit thing, that's most frequently omitted, and yet, particularly in the early stages of your startup, that's the most important element. And the reason why is your job is to establish whether these people really want to do these things or not. And it's that last component, the derive a benefit part of it, where you're really stating why you think they want to do this. How many of you guys use user stories for product development at your firms? I bet some of you in software do. Yeah. And so there's, companies will get set up and they'll say, okay, well, we're going to write user stories now. And that's good. That's always going to help a bit. But, just like anything else, it's a format. It can be used well or it can be used poorly. And the important thing to do is to marry it with these personas, to marry it with these ideas of intent of why these people want to do these particular things. In stories, it may seem like kind of how many of you guys have written a requirements document? Yeah, wow, yeah. So I have to, it may seem a little fast and loose to propose to build a whole entire product based on stories, but it absolutely works. And there are organizing heuristics for stories that help you manage that. The top level heuristic is an epic story. So this is a story that will encapsulate several other stories. Then we have the stories themselves, and then we have within those stories this idea of test cases. Test cases are these things, hey, make sure that it works with MasterCard, make sure that X. We'll look through a few examples when we go through the next segment, and we're actually going to talk about lean systems. So you can build big, complicated products based on user stories, and particularly if you're operating against an unknown problem, whether that's a brand new product for a brand new company, or even a line extension of your existing product that you don't really know whether the customer is going to like yet, this is a very good way to talk about users and to create something that's consumable for your developers. And we'll talk about how that works towards the end here. So the main thing about design thinking is that there's people that are professional designers, but anybody can practice design thinking. It's quite easy. The main thing is you have to want to do it. And the main thing you have to want to do is produce something really good that users really like. And I think that when I look at the people I work with and I look at my own staff, that is the most powerful predictor if somebody's going to do a good job with this or not. And that's good news. If you want to do it, you'll be able to do it. It's not very hard. You may not be the person that can make those sewing scissors. Actually, probably a lot of you guys are. But if you're not the person that can make a pair of sewing scissors, you can absolutely be the person that comes up with the idea that this seamstress needs sewing scissors. Any of you can do that. That's absolutely doable. So the next concept we have is planning. So before, we had the 5-year plan, which I actually think was invented by Lenin for the implementation of communist totalitarianism. And then it was adapted to large companies, and then it was adapted to startups. And the alternative that we have now is this use of the scientific method of iterative management, which was popularized by the lean startup about a year ago. And it turns out that this is a much better way to do startups, and really almost any company. And we'll talk about how we do this at Lean, where we have both things where we know the market, we know the solution, and things where we don't. So what happened before was you had the 5-year plan. It was this thing that everybody felt obliged to create, and then everybody knew, the VCs always call it the big lie. And it was this sort of mutually participatory lie that everybody participated in about what was going to happen, because even in a mature company, forecasts almost never come true. So the idea that you're going to make a 5-year forecast for a startup is absolutely, completely crazy. So the alternative, though, of having no plan at all, which is often what even de facto happens when you use this 5-year plan, because nobody's really paying attention to it anyway, is equally unmanageable. It's terrible to have no plan. Because in a startup, you have this extremely difficult pairing of uncertainty and urgency. Personally, for me at least, it's one of the most difficult management environments you can possibly imagine. So there was this great standby all along that was recently popularized by Eric Ries's science. You're all familiar with the scientific method. You went to Stanford, right? So we all learned it probably in grade school. So in the scientific method, you have an idea. And in the context of a new product, you're asking yourself, do I have compelling evidence from my users and my buyers that this is compelling? And that's what you're doing at the very beginning. Then you have a hypothesis, which of course is just a set of assumptions, propositions that are provable or disprovable. And then from there you move on and you create an experimental design. How am I going to prove or disprove these things in the quickest, cheapest, fastest way possible? you carry out these experiments, and by the way, this is one of the most powerful things about this framework, is that by laying out all these assumptions for everybody, showing them to everybody, this creates an extremely usable focal point for managing your startup, which I've always found a very difficult thing to do. You look at your results, and at this point, you'll be able to figure out, hey, were we wrong? Did we disprove this? We need to go back through, revise, loop through this again? Or was this a good idea and we should scale this up? And this is equally important, because another thing that happens to startups a lot of times is like, all right, well, let's see, we're going to need a bunch of developers, we're going to need a marketing person, a salesperson, a business development. You don't need all those people when you don't know what you're going to build or who you're going to sell it to yet. I absolutely don't need them, and you don't want to spend all your precious resources, especially in this operating environment, until you know that you've validated your basic proposition and you want to scale up the business. So how do you actually do this? It's very easy. I have a little template, but obviously you don't really need that. You have your priority for these things. It's very important to prioritize. You want to prioritize things that are most important and most easy to prove. Those are your best ones, and you want to prove those first, and then you kind of work on down there. You want to have the assumption, and then you want to have, does this need to be proven? Because this is a crucial point. Just because an assumption is important doesn't mean you shouldn't lay it out, but it also doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be proven. So for instance, let's say we have an app for distributing allowances. Do parents want an app to do that? Yes, absolutely, you need to prove that. Nobody's going to accept that at absolutely being true. Do you need to prove that parents have smartphones? No. Is it important? Absolutely, yeah, of course. But you don't need to prove that. But it is important to lay that out, because stepping through this in a rigorous way is really what's crucial and what will keep you organized and focused on validating the business. Another tool that's really good that fills a little bit of this vacuum left by abandoning, in some sense, the 5-year plan is the business model canvas. How many of you guys are familiar with that? It's very popular. A guy named Alex Osterwalder, who's with the same group at YLA, actually. I think that we kind of adapted his format for the book. He introduced this, as a European guy, about a year or 2 years ago, and this is very popular. It's a good way to make sure you think through all the facets of the business without going through and losing yourself and writing paragraphs and paragraphs of stuff. We'll go through an example in a minute. And then you absolutely need a financial model. And the one thing I see is that you want to avoid the middle place in the financial model. The focus for financial models for startups is very bimodal. You need to be very focused on the short term. You need to have a very, very detail-oriented view of expenses, because you don't want to have to constantly worry about money and not know when you're going to have revenue and worry about whether you're going to run out of cash. And then on the other side of the whole thing, you want a model that allows you to extrapolate out the business at scale once you start understanding your unit economies. What you don't want to spend a lot of time on, and what I see, not everybody, but a lot of entrepreneurs do, is spend time on this middle place, where it's like, well, what's the business going to look like in year 2? So all these calculations and inputs and variables, and it doesn't matter, because you don't know. So if I asked you guys, what's the temperature going to be in Menlo Park tomorrow, you could probably look on your phones and you could tell me, and you're pretty close to being right. But if I said, okay, well, what's it going to be out to 3 significant digits, there's no amount of research or calculation or extrapolation you could do that would make that answer any more accurate. So that's the kind of thing you want to evolve to when you're doing these financial models, an ability to look at the short term in a very, very rigorous way and then extrapolate out the long term, but avoid a lot of time spent on that middle place. So these are the 3 tools that I think are most useful. We're going to go through an example, and I'll show you guys where there are a couple templates that you can pull these things. The next thing we have is organization. So how do you build a startup organization? And the thing that we had before, and I was at a couple places where like this, is this proposition, and it sounds crazy, but you guys all went through the dot-com period, you've probably been through this, is what I call aping. The idea that, well, we'll make this little company a big company by making everybody act like we're in a big company and hiring people from big companies. And it sounds crazy, but that happens a lot. And then there's an alternative, which is this idea that was introduced by Steve Blank in this book called 4 Steps to the Epiphany of customer development. So what we got from that was this idea that a startup it's not a smaller version of a big company. It's fundamentally different. It needs to be organized differently. And the organizational structure that makes sense is a very flat, homogeneous, organizationally homogeneous customer development team And that team's sole job is to go out and formulate and validate those assumptions. And this is good because the last thing you want in a startup, and you probably all seen this, is like, well, we have the engineering department, and they're going to consider what to build, and sales is supposed to go sell this. That's absolutely not the kind of activity that makes any sense in a startup, because if you don't know what you're going to go out and do, none of these organizational things with this department and that department make any sense for that type of mission. And at Leonid, so you may ask, well, how does that really work? At Leonid, we have a very process-driven organization for our mainline products where we've ascertained this product market fit. So sales sells stuff, development builds it, operations installs it and maintains it. And you absolutely have to have this, because the flip side of this whole thing is it's not the proposition of this set of ideas that processes and missions and departments and things are bad. Plenty of startups fall on their face because they fail to do these things as they do scale. And so the proposition is, it's only when you don't have this product market fit yet. So at Leonid, we create customer development teams that are responsible for line extensions, new products, and it's just a different way of organizing everyone for a different type of mission. So you have a scale mission where you're trying to scale the business, and then you have a startup mission where you're trying to figure out what the business is, and these are the two different ways you organize them. Let's look at how all this stuff kind of gels together, the old way and the new way. Probably a lot of you guys have been through this narrative. So our founders get a great new idea. It's exciting. Then they go and they create a 5-year plan, because that's what venture capitalists, private capital in general, wants to see. And it shows 10x returns, because that's what, when you have no revenue, you might as well say that. And that's the kind of returns you need to show a venture capitalist to get money. So they do this. And of course, it creates a chain of assumptions that's so long and so tenuous that everybody would be better off going out and doing the lottery in terms of being actually right, not necessarily in terms of being successful in general. So the VCs want to do it. These guys are in a hot space, and the VCs need to close out their fund, and they're going to do it. So they want to put in a lot of capital, the VCs, because they're mostly kind of in a scale business themselves. A little deal doesn't make sense. Only a big deal makes sense. And so they bring in a menagerie of professionals, accountants, lawyers, that are their buddies, and they all in there, doing things, this aping thing of, let's make this startup look like a big company, and then hopefully it'll just morph into a big company. And the thing there is it's not to say that everybody works at a big company is going to do a bad job in a startup. That's not true. But big company experience and the things that you learn how to do as a manager to scale a business are just so fundamentally different than the things you learn as an entrepreneur to create a business and ascertain a product market fit. So that happens. These hires come in, they want, where's my secretary, who's doing my paperwork, and they're put to work on actualizing this 5-year plan, which is this fiction. And the hires, probably the core problem again is that they lack this experience and this belief that their main job is just to get their hands on the user and figure out what the solution should be. And the expanded team is working to conform to this 5-year plan, and that's almost, even if they're successful, that's not going to happen. And then you go to your first board meeting, and I mean, how many of you had to prepare these elaborate fictions for a board meeting against a 5-year plan? I have plenty of times. I got so good at it. I was like, this stuff's terrible. I'm so good at making up these stories to kind of backwards explain our 5-year plan. It was such an interesting activity. This isn't when I had the fiduciary ability of being on the board. This was just me, as a grunt working in a startup in the dot-com period. So you can kind of see where this is headed. Now let's look at how this works when we do these alternative things. Our founders get a new idea. The first thing that they do is they lay out their key assumptions. They figure out what things need to be true that need to be proven to make this business work, and they're 100% focused on validating those things. This will reduce the amount of capital that they need because they have, A, reduced the initial risk of the business, presumably working a bit by themselves. 2, they're not going to bite off the whole thing of like, hey, I need a whole bunch of money to build a company. No, they just need what they need to build a team and a set of resources to go out and discover whether they have a business here or not. Then maybe they go and they get capital, maybe they don't, maybe they just get a little bit of friends and family money, maybe they bootstrap it and do something that the business can do and not distract itself too much and make money. In the meantime, that's what we did at Leonid. I'll tell you guys about that in the next segment. And they bring in resources as needed. They are completely focused on validating these assumptions, which again is great because how many of you guys have been the CEO or the owner, leader of a startup before? Yeah, it's very hard, I think. Did you guys think it was hard?
Yeah.
I thought it was hard. I still do. And so these assumptions give them a focal point for everybody to look at and understand, when they walk in, one of the hardest parts of a running startup is there's all this stuff going on. You walk into the office in the morning, what should you do? There's so many things, running around, oh, this so-and-so called us and maybe wants to talk to us. There's so many things going on. One of the biggest challenges is just when you walk in the morning, does everybody know what they ought to be doing? So their roles, their success criteria are clear. They're operating against these assumptions. They're driving towards a pivot or persevere moment that they've presumably established a finite period in time when they're just going to look at this. And progress is measurable. When it's time to face the music in the board, which this just may be the founders themselves, maybe people they brought in to help them, they're able to look at the data and say, well, does this prove or disprove what we thought we were going to make a business out of? And that's nice because everybody gets to talk about what happened and what they learned rather than, backpedaling on this 5-year plan. And this works pretty well. The worst thing that will happen is you'll learn a whole bunch of things about how to learn about a new market or a new product. So let's talk about development. The old way was waterfall. You guys went to Stanford. I'm sure you guys have all heard everybody say how bad it is and all that. And it's, it's not, bless you, it's not categorically bad, of course, but the nice thing about Agile, I think there's 3 core things that I find. You guys are all familiar with Agile probably. The idea of Agile is you work in small batches. We'll talk about what it is in a second. The most important attributes, I think, are number 1, linkage with design thinking. Because our inputs into development here are personas and stories, which we talked about how important those are, particularly at the outset. So there's a very, very good link, if you're doing it right, of Agile and design thinking. What I see a lot of is you have kind of a situation where the engineering team, and I see this at big companies, where the engineering team does Agile because hey, it works, it's modern technique for doing software. But the whole part of getting user stories and personas from the people that are out there in the market, they kind of sweep that under the rug because they don't want us to deal with all those business people getting in their hair. So that you may still get some of the benefits of Agile, but you'll lose one of the most important attributes of it. The second thing is that it helps you operate in small batches. So there's a proposition like, well, Agile's just universally better. I'm not sure you really get things built faster in absolute terms, but what you get to do is see the stuff in smaller batches, which is so important for all the reasons that we just talked about. We're looking at assumptions. We need to show customers things quickly because there's no point in delivering this big, elaborate, wonderful thing if nobody wants it. And that's the second thing about Agile that I think is extremely helpful. So the interesting thing about Agile is, there's few communities of interest that have generated more raw pages of stuff. I mean, there's different flavors of Agile. You can go to a bookstore and there's these big books. The interesting thing that I'm always surprised how few people know this is that the actual Agile manifesto that was written in 2001 was only 68 words long. So if Agile seems a little remote to you because you haven't been hands-on in a software development organization, rest assured you can read it on your phone in a few seconds. So it says 4 things primarily. 1, they value individual interactions over processes and tools, and that's because the important thing is we're here, we're sitting together, and we're talking about the user, we're talking about the customer. We're not following some arbitrary requirements document, which many of you have written, where we don't know whether we're right or not. We're not explaining ourselves very well to the implementer. The second thing is value working software over comprehensive documentation. And that's this thing of doing it in small batches, seeing if the thing's going to make any difference or not. And this is so important because most software companies now, at least, are more about, does anybody want to buy this thing, then can we build this thing? Because then you can pretty much build anything you want in software. The third thing is they value customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and they value responding to change over following a plan. That's that's again this thing of agile batches are usually 2 to 6 weeks. You deliver, whether or not you release it, you deliver something that's finished in 2 to 6 weeks, and it's available at least for your internal audiences to see it, play with it, and validate the assumptions that were attached to it. So what's life actually like? You've got the iteration that you just finished. So you've got a set of content that your implementers produced. And your job, if you're the business owner or you're the person that's in charge of really what this product should be and learning whether there's a problem out there for you to solve or not, your job is to go out and validate this stuff with customers. And this is one of the most important parts of Agile in this context, because a lot of software is just built for internal audiences at companies. And a lot of the methods that were created around that have to do with the assumption that, well, this is being built for a manufacturing plant somewhere, and there's some guy that runs that plant, he knows exactly how this thing should work. And he can stand over the person's shoulder and say, no, it should do this, no, it shouldn't do that. In a situation with a startup, you don't have that facet of Agile. You don't have that aspect of what the product owner is going to do for you. Product owner is a person in Agile that is responsible for answering questions about, should we go left or should we go right here? So that person's job is to go out and validate assumptions. It is a fallacy in a startup to think that, well, hey, dude, you're supposed to know whether the user's going to like this or not, which is a reasonable thing to say if, again, you're on contract, you're building something inside an organization. It's not a reasonable thing to think if you're in a startup. Nobody really knows. You have to design the whole system for actual hands-on validation in the real world. And in the present iteration, you're collaborating with development teams. It's your job to help answer questions and more so illuminate intent and explain the stories and the personas that you've created. And in the iteration that's coming, you're taking what you've learned here as you're going out and validating the old stuff, and you're figuring out what you should build in the next cycle. And this is the critical corollary, you're attaching assumptions to those things, because it's not your job to know with absolute certainty whether those things are going to make sense or not. It's not realistic in a startup. It is your job to set them up so they can go out and be validated with customers. And whether you're going to prove or disprove that stuff was a good idea to build or not. So in summary, conceptually, we've got design thinking. This gives us a direction, it gives us personas, and it gives us user stories that are inputs into this idea of iterative management, what gives us the idea of using the scientific method of formulating a hypothesis that's testable, getting results that we can use to prove or disprove, figure out whether we should loop through and try this whole thing again, or, hey, we're right, we've got something we should scale up and start spending more money on. The customer development gives us an organizational structure for how to actually do all this stuff, because it's different than a big company. And Agile gives us working product in very, very, very small batches.